Balkan kingdom, standard scenery for operettas. Yugoslavia used to be typical travelogue country. Hand spinning, primitive cooking, traditional dances, quaint native costumes. As the music of the Macedonian kolo faded into the distance, we promised ourselves we'd come back to the little village of Vranje someday. And one day we did, but not as tourists. This plane wasn't sightseeing. Major Randolph Churchill was the only survivor. The crew which burned this C-47 had no guidebook to tell them whether they'd landed behind enemy lines. And these American airmen weren't exactly touring on the way back from Ploesti, August 1943. They came down near the Bulgarian border. American and British airmen were scattered all over the country, and there were a few New Zealanders who had escaped from prison camps in northern Italy. The Allies had to get these flyers out somehow. Yugoslavia, 1943, was an hour from American bases in Italy as a plane flies, and about 200 years by ox cart. In 1943, we had plenty of reasons for returning to the little villages of Yugoslavia. Everywhere, the resistance of the Yugoslav people was forging a new front against German and Bulgarian Nazis. But they needed hospitalization. They needed help in organization. And they needed all sorts of military supplies. Those were the reasons Colonel Lynn Farish took a party of OSS men into Yugoslavia with an Anglo-American mission. This film shows OSS activities with the Yugoslav People's Army of National Liberation, operating behind enemy lines. The mission is escorted from Brindisi, Italy by Thunderbolts and dropped in to establish headquarters in the Petrovac area. Brigadier McLean, center, heads the mission. They were in partisan-held territory near Marshal Tito's headquarters at Drvar. Tito, second from the left, is shown here with his chief of staff, and on his right, the former editor of a political newspaper in Belgrade. He also had with him at this time a Russian general and two other Russian officers. Lieutenant Popovich, OSS, meeting partisans, took most of these pictures and was assistant to Colonel Farish, whose report forms the basis for this film. OSS men lived with a partisan family who hoped a son in Duquesne, Pennsylvania would see this film someday. The family also operated a still for making plum brandy. OSS found that the partisans depended for their food upon what local peasants brought in, and that the only military supplies they had were those captured from the Italians. Colonel Farish reports, when our officers called back for aid, we had one thing in mind: barefoot, cold, and hungry people whose courage and endurance must be observed to be understood. To us, they were not communists or reactionaries, partisans or chetniks, but merely brave people who looked to us for aid, with the confidence that it would be forthcoming. The diary of Lieutenant Popovich records, there were quite a few parachute failures when supplies were dropped in. Once, the Italian pilot overshot the field and everything went up on the mountains, and we had to hunt for days. Communication with the outside was difficult when essential radio equipment like this was damaged beyond repair. Nevertheless, there was no let-up in the work of strengthening the resistance and preparing the rescue of Allied flyers. For if the Yugoslavs needed help, the Allies also needed them. Colonel Farish testifies that in the records of the 15th Air Force, there is evidence that practically every faction in Yugoslavia has aided in the rescue and evacuation of our men forced down in that country. The people who have aided our men were the common people of Yugoslavia. On the 16th of April, 1944, began one of the most exciting stories to come out of the Balkans when the Columbia Party of OSS went into southeast Serbia, establishing contact with the commander of the 1st Serbian Division, Brko. Since they were within a short distance of enemy lines, no time was lost making ready for the evacuation of the region. Armed with Bren guns brought in by OSS, the partisans prepared to escort the Columbia Party to a prearranged rendezvous with rescue planes. OSS men were warned to travel with light kits because they'd be crossing rough terrain through enemy territory. In 2 months, the Columbia Party passed through enemy lines 7 times, traveling altogether about 700 miles. Three of these times they carried wounded American airmen on stretchers or in ox carts. This man developed an abscessed appendix. Lieutenant Johnson, American navigator, on horseback with a broken ankle, was rescued from a partisan hospital just before it was captured by the Chetniks. Of the other men in Johnson's plane, 4 were already saved. The pilot and co-pilot were believed captured by the Germans. The bombardier was missing, and a crewman was known to be with Chetniks. On many operations, the party had to approach within 100 yards of Bulgarian garrisons, and once they had to walk crouched over so they wouldn't be picked up by German searchlights. After May 27th, a sudden advance of the Nazi Brandenburg Division made things too hot to take any more pictures of southeast Serbia. But the story of the OSS Columbia Party comes to a happy ending with rescue completed June 16, 1944. Meanwhile, the bombing of Petrovac while the Germans were trying to get Tito was a reminder to all internal factions as well as to the Allies of the existence of the common enemy. New airfields constantly had to be located by OSS as old ones were bombed or captured by the enemy. Partisan women did most of the work getting them into shape. This one was about 30 kilometers from enemy lines. Wounded partisans were brought together for the final flight to safe hospitals in Italy. With the only available pickup point under constant enemy air observation and without more substantial shelter, their only protection was the camouflage of dried-up leaves. Major Goodwin, OSS, shares his cigarettes with a partisan. The hour of final rescue approached as other parties with their escorts converged on the landing field of Petrovac. After arrangements had been completed with base headquarters for flying the Allied airmen and wounded partisans out of the country, the pioneer section of partisan supporters would work all night making the airfield ready. Once, 1,100 people had to keep shoveling ahead of a snowstorm until the planes arrived. Everybody cut wood for the fires which would signal the relief planes in. Waiting to be picked up, 4 Allied airmen who'd been in the country 11 months said, "These people go for Americans. They speak of Americans and God in the same way." At last, the first evacuation planes were sighted and the fire pattern started. But not everybody could be flown out. Many civilian refugees were taken to safety in surface craft by way of the island of Vis. As the successful OSS mission left Yugoslavia, Lieutenant Popovich's last comment was, "Our men left with the people a wonderful impression of America and the armed forces of the United States. This is proven by the fact that these people have helped them at the risk of their lives and the burning of their homes."